Kendra adjusted her gloves, pushing the cleaning cart into the bright lobby of Mecker Global Enterprises. Sunlight streamed through the towering windows, illuminating the polished marble floors. Her sneakers squeaked softly with each step, a sound lost amid the bustling rhythm of the office workers around her. She preferred the predictability of the job, the steadiness that kept her life simple and free from surprises. Her uniform was slightly oversized, but it allowed her to blend into the background unnoticed. And that was just how she liked it. It gave her the space to observe without being part of the noise. But there was one thing Kendra always carried with her: the small gold pendant around her neck. It was subtle, easily overlooked by others, but it meant everything to her. Given to her by her mother when she was a child, it was her only link to a past that was mostly a blur. Her mother had called it a piece of her story, though Kendra never fully understood its meaning. Still, she treasured it. By 3 p.m., Kendra had reached the upper floors, where the building's elite worked. These were the people in sleek suits who never spared her more than a passing glance. Kendra didn't mind. She kept her head down, focused on her work. But today, something was different. The air felt charged, heavier with an unspoken tension. She brushed it off, chalking it up to fatigue. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and she had responsibilities: rent to pay, groceries to buy, and a life to maintain. She knocked gently on the glass door of Charles Mecker's corner office. His name was known to everyone, even to those who didn't work directly with him. The mastermind behind the empire. Kendra had seen him around, tall, commanding, with a presence that made people straighten up when he entered a room. Today, however, the blinds were half drawn, and the office felt unnervingly quiet. "Mr. Mecker," she called softly, pushing the door open just enough to peek inside. Her heart skipped a beat. Charles Mecker was slumped over his desk, his face pale and lifeless. Papers lay scattered across the desk, frozen in time. Panic surged through Kendra, paralyzing her for a split second, before her training kicked in. "Help!" she cried out, rushing to his side. Her heart raced as she checked for signs of life. She recalled a video she'd seen about performing CPR in an emergency. "Think, Kendra," she muttered under her breath. With trembling hands, she tilted his head back and began chest compressions, pushing down rhythmically. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Don't you die on me." Minutes dragged on like hours. Finally, the sound of footsteps and shouts reached her ears as security and paramedics rushed in. Kendra stepped back, hands shaking, as they took over. "What happened?" one of the medics asked. I found him like that," she stammered, still catching her breath. They worked quickly, stabilizing Charles and preparing to transport him to the hospital. Kendra stood frozen, her mind replaying the scene over and over. Had she done enough? Had she done it right? "Miss, are you okay?" one of the security guards asked gently. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice betrayed her exhaustion. "Is he going to be okay?" "They got him just in time," the medic said before wheeling Charles out of the office. Kendra sank into the chair he had been slumped over moments ago, her hands still trembling. Her eyes wandered across the desk, taking in the papers, the photos, and the personal items scattered about. Then something caught her eye: a framed photograph of a smiling woman. Her hair was dark and wavy, and she wore a pendant identical to Kendra's. Her stomach churned, and a chill ran down her spine. "That's impossible," she whispered. She touched her own pendant instinctively, her fingers tracing its smooth edges. The resemblance between the one in the photograph and hers was uncanny. The image burned into her mind as the office grew eerily quiet once again. Kendra shook her head, trying to dismiss the strange connection. It was just a coincidence. It had to be. Little did she know, that pendant was about to change her life forever. The hospital room was quiet, save for the faint beeping of machines monitoring Charles Mecker's condition. Kendra stood hesitantly at the doorway, clutching her pendant tightly. She had no intention of following Charles here, but a nurse had insisted, telling her, He's been asking for you? Her thoughts raced. Why would someone as powerful as Charles Mecker care about a janitor who happened to save his life? She stepped inside cautiously, her sneakers squeaking softly on the polished floor. Charles was propped up in bed, his complexion pale, but his sharp eyes focused on her the moment she entered. For a man who had just narrowly escaped death, his presence was striking. "You're Kendra, right?" he said, his voice raspier than she expected. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm glad to see you're okay." Charles gestured for her to come closer. "I need to ask you something about that pendant around your neck." Kendra's hand instinctively flew to the small gold charm resting against her chest. "My pendant?" He nodded, his expression unreadable. "May I see it?" Her instincts told her to refuse. The pendant was deeply personal, the only connection she had to her late mother. But something in Charles's eyes, a mixture of desperation and disbelief, convinced her otherwise. Reluctantly, she stepped closer and leaned forward, allowing him to examine it. His hand trembled as he touched it lightly, his breath catching in his throat. His reaction made Kendra's stomach twist. This was my wife's," Charles murmured, his voice breaking. "It's identical. The engraving, forever mark." Kendra frowned, her pulse quickening. "What? No, this belonged to my mom. She gave it to me before she passed." Charles looked up at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Where did your mother get it? Did she tell you anything about its origin?" Kendra hesitated. "She never said much. Just that it was special." I don't know anything else." For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Then Charles reached for a button on the bedside table, summoning a nurse. "I need someone to bring me the family photos from my office," he told the nurse firmly. "Right now." The urgency in his tone made Kendra shift uncomfortably. "I think I should go," she said, taking a step back. "No," Charles said quickly. "Please. I need a moment. If I'm wrong, I'll leave you alone, but if I'm right—" His voice trailed off, his gaze distant. Kendra's curiosity won out over her apprehension, and she stayed. Minutes later, a young assistant arrived carrying a sleek black folder. Charles flipped through it with shaky hands until he pulled out a photograph. "Here," he said, holding it out to Kendra. The image was of a woman with soft, dark waves cascading over her shoulders. Her smile was radiant, and around her neck was the same pendant Kendra wore. Kendra's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She couldn't look away from the woman in the photo. Her mother had passed when she was young, but this woman, she could almost see the resemblance. "No," Kendra said, shaking her head. "This doesn't make sense. My mother, her name was Agnes. She was nobody important. We lived in a small apartment. She worked at a diner." "She wasn't," Charles interrupted softly. "Her name was Sandra. Sandra Mecker." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Kendra stared at him, her mind racing to reconcile his claim with everything she thought she knew about her life. "That's impossible," she whispered. "She died in a car accident. I was adopted after she passed." Charles's face darkened. "Sandra didn't just die. She disappeared 25 years ago. My wife was pregnant, and then she was gone. Her car was found at the bottom of a ravine, but her body was never recovered. I've spent every day since then wondering what really happened." Kendra's legs felt like they might give out. You think I'm your daughter?" Charles nodded slowly. "The pendant. The engraving. I had it made for her the day she told me she was pregnant. It's one of a kind. If you're wearing it, there's no other explanation." Kendra stumbled back, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, this can't be real. I'm just a janitor. I'm not part of your world." "Kendra," Charles said gently, "if there's even a chance, don't you want to know the truth?" Tears welled up in her eyes. The truth. She'd spent her entire life not knowing where she came from, and now a stranger was offering her answers she wasn't sure she wanted. "I need time," she said finally, her voice trembling. Charles nodded, his expression softening. Take all the time you need. But please think about it. Kendra fled the room, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. Her hands trembled as she clutched the pendant tighter than ever. That night, as she lay in her small apartment staring at the ceiling, the photograph of Sandra Mecker haunted her. Could it be true? Could she really be the daughter of Charles Mecker, the man whose life she'd saved just hours earlier? She didn't have answers, but one thing was clear. Her life would never be the same. Kendra spent the following day in a haze, her mind replaying every word Charles had said. Each time she touched the pendant, her thoughts spiraled into questions she didn't have the courage to confront. Could it really be true? Could she be the daughter of Sandra Mecker, a woman she didn't even remember? The sound of her phone buzzing snapped her back to reality. It was a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated before answering. Hello? Kendra, it's Charles Mecker. Her grip tightened on the phone. How did you get my number? I asked the hospital staff, he said, his voice calm but urgent. Please don't be upset. I need to talk to you properly. I need to explain everything. Can we meet somewhere neutral? Kendra hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. I'm not sure that's a good idea, she said. Look, Charles continued, his tone softening. I don't want to pressure you, but I owe you an explanation. If you don't want to see me after that, I'll respect your wishes. Her heart raced as she considered his words. Finally, she exhaled. Fine. There's a diner near my apartment. I'll text you the address. Thank you, Charles said, relief evident in his voice. An hour later, Kendra sat in a booth at the small retro-style diner, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. She had arrived early, partly out of nerves, partly out of habit. The place was familiar to her, a corner of the world where she felt safe. The doorbell jingled, and she looked up to see Charles entering, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed out of place among the diner's worn leather seats and checkered floors. Despite his polished appearance, he looked uneasy, almost vulnerable. Kendra, he greeted her with a small nod, sliding into the booth across from her. Thank you for meeting me? She shrugged, still wary. I want answers. That's all. He nodded, understanding the weight of her guarded tone. Fair enough. Let me start from the beginning. Charles took a deep breath before recounting the story of his life with Sandra. He spoke of their love, their dreams, and the moment they found out they were expecting a child. His voice wavered as he described the day of the accident, the phone call that shattered his world. I spent weeks searching for her, he said, his eyes glistening. When they found the car, I thought that was it. But something never felt right. The body wasn't there. And now here you are, wearing the pendant I gave her. Kendra stared at him, her coffee forgotten. But how could I have survived? How did I end up with my mom, with Agnes? I don't know, Charles admitted. But I'm determined to find out. If you let me, I'll help you uncover the truth. Kendra's walls began to crack, just slightly. And what if it's not true? What if this is all just a coincidence? Then we'll have closure, Charles said simply. But if there's even a chance, don't you think it's worth pursuing? She looked away, the weight of his words sinking in. For so long, she had resigned herself to not knowing her origins. The idea of digging up the past both terrified and intrigued her. Okay, she said finally. Where do we start? Charles smiled, a flicker of hope lighting his face. I've already made a few calls. There are adoption records we can look into, people we can talk to. But it'll take time. Are you ready for that? Kendra nodded, though uncertainty still lingered in her chest. I guess so. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the waitress, who placed their food on the table. Charles's plate was a stark contrast to Kendra's modest grilled cheese and fries, a reflection of the worlds they came from. As they ate, Charles asked her about her life. Kendra found herself opening up, talking about her late mother, her struggles growing up, and the simplicity of her daily routine. To her surprise, Charles listened intently, as though every detail mattered. "You've been through a lot," he said quietly. Kendra shrugged, attempting to mask her emotions. "Life happens. You deal with it." Charles leaned forward, his expression serious. "If this turns out to be true, you won't have to deal with it alone anymore." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she saw not a powerful businessman, but a man who had suffered just as much as she had. When they finished their meal, Charles pulled out a small notebook. "I'll start looking into the records tomorrow. If you find anything, old papers, letters, anything your mom might have left behind, let me know, okay?" Kendra's voice softened. "I will." As they walked out of the diner, the cool evening air wrapped around them. Kendra glanced at Charles, a mixture of doubt and hope swirling inside her. "Good night, Kendra," he said, giving her a small smile before heading toward his car. "Good night," she replied, watching him leave. As she walked back to her apartment, her pendant seemed heavier than usual, as if carrying the weight of the questions yet to be answered. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was on the edge of something extraordinary. The morning sun filtered through Kendra's thin apartment curtains as she sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the pendant resting in her palm. The gold gleamed in the soft light, its intricate engraving catching her eye. "Forever Mark." It felt heavier now, not just in weight but in meaning. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Charles. "Good morning. I found a contact at the adoption agency. They're willing to meet us at noon. Can you make it?" Kendra's heart raced. She hesitated for a moment before typing back, "I'll be there by noon." She found herself standing outside a nondescript building in the heart of the city. The sign above the door read New Horizons Adoption Agency. Charles was already waiting, his tailored coat shielding him from the brisk wind. "Ready?" he asked, his expression a mixture of determination and nervousness. "As ready as I'll ever be," Kendra replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. Inside, they were greeted by a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Mr. Mecker, Mrs. Kenneth, thank you for coming. I'm Margaret. Please, follow me." Margaret led them into a quiet office filled with neatly stacked files and the faint scent of coffee. She gestured for them to sit before taking her place behind the desk. "I understand you're looking for information about Miss Kenneth's adoption," Margaret began, glancing at a folder in front of her. "I've reviewed the records you provided, and I have to say this case is unusual." "Unusual how?" Kendra asked, leaning forward. "Well," Margaret continued, flipping through the file, "the records show that you were placed in the foster system under emergency circumstances. There was no documentation of parental consent, which is highly irregular. Typically, even in cases of abandonment, there's some kind of official documentation. But in your case, there's nothing." Kendra frowned, her mind racing. "What does that mean? Was it a mistake?" Margaret shook her head. "It's hard to say. The system was much less organized back then. But there's one detail that stands out." She slid a photocopy across the desk. It was a handwritten note, yellowed with age. The words were hurried, almost frantic. "Please take care of my baby. She has no one else." Kendra's chest tightened as she read the note. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the sentiment struck a chord deep within her. "Does this look familiar to you?" Margaret asked gently. Kendra shook her head. "No, but it sounds like my mom. She always told me I was all she had." Charles, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Is there any way to trace who left the note? Security cameras? Witness accounts?" Margaret sighed. "Unfortunately, no. The note was left at a hospital, and the baby, Kendra, was brought here afterward. The hospital records from that time are incomplete." Charles's jaw tightened, frustration evident in his expression. "There has to be something else, anything." Margaret hesitated before opening another file. "There is one more thing, the pendant." Kendra's eyes widened. "What about it?" "When you were found, the pendant was wrapped in the blanket with you. It's not common for children in such situations to have items like this. It was documented as personal property, but no one claimed it. Charles leaned forward, his voice urgent. Could we cross-reference the engraving? Maybe find out who made it? Margaret nodded. That's possible. If it's custom, a jeweler might have records. Kendra clutched the pendant tightly. The thought of uncovering more about her past was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. As they left the office, Charles turned to Kendra. This is progress. We're closer to answers. Kendra nodded, though her mind was still racing. Closer, but not there yet. Charles placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll get there. Later that afternoon, they visited a jeweler Charles had called ahead of time. The small shop was filled with the soft chime of wind chimes and the glint of polished metal. An elderly man behind the counter greeted them warmly. You must be the ones with the pendant, he said, adjusting his glasses. Yes, Kendra said, handing it over. The jeweler examined it closely, his fingers tracing the delicate engraving. Beautiful craftsmanship. Definitely custom-made. Give me a moment. He disappeared into the back room, leaving Kendra and Charles alone. Do you think he'll find anything? Kendra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. If this pendant is as unique as it seems, I'm confident, Charles replied. Minutes later, the jeweler returned, holding a dusty ledger. You're in luck. This piece was made here about 25 years ago. The engraving matches an order placed by a Mr. Charles Mecker. Kendra's breath hitched. She turned to Charles, who looked equally stunned. I knew it, he whispered. The jeweler continued, oblivious to their shock. This design was exclusive. Only one like it was ever made. I remember the customer. He was very specific about the engraving, something special for someone special. Kendra's knees felt weak. She gripped the counter for support, her mind spinning. Thank you, Charles said to the jeweler, his voice thick with emotion. As they left the shop, Kendra stopped on the sidewalk, her hand clutching the pendant once more. It's real, she said, her voice trembling. This is really happening? Charles nodded. We're not just chasing shadows, Kendra. We're chasing the truth. The weight of his words settled over her as they walked in silence. For the first time, she felt like the past wasn't so distant, and that uncovering it might finally give her the answers she'd been searching for her entire life. The Mecker estate was nothing short of magnificent. Nestled on the outskirts of New York City, its sprawling grounds were adorned with manicured gardens, marble fountains, and an imposing mansion that seemed to belong more to a fairy tale than the real world. Kendra felt completely out of place as she walked beside Charles, who had insisted she meet someone important that evening. Charles had barely spoken during the car ride, his jaw set with an uncharacteristic tension. When Kendra pressed him about why they were going to his family's estate, he simply said, "It's time you met Sam." Kendra didn't know much about Charles's brother, other than his name came up once or twice in their conversations. She could sense there was an unspoken tension there, a history that Charles wasn't eager to share. As they entered the grand foyer, Kendra marveled at the opulence around her, polished hardwood floors, crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with portraits of Mecker ancestors. Before she could take it all in, a man's voice echoed from the adjacent room. Charles, I didn't expect you to drop by unannounced. Kendra turned to see Sam Mecker striding into the room. He was tall and impeccably dressed, with sharp features and a confident, almost predatory air about him. His eyes immediately flicked to Kendra, curiosity flashing across his face. And who's this? Sam asked, his tone smooth but laced with something Kendra couldn't quite place. This is Kendra Kenneth, Charles said firmly. She's someone very important. Kendra felt Sam's gaze linger on her, scrutinizing her as if trying to decipher a puzzle. Important, you say? What exactly makes her so special? Sam asked. Charles's jaw tightened. It's complicated. She might be connected to Jew. At the mention of the name, Sam's expression shifted ever so slightly. It was subtle, too subtle for most to notice, But Kendra caught it. A flicker of unease quickly masked by a disarming smile. "Sandra, huh?" Sam said, his voice taking on a lighter, almost dismissive tone. "That's a name I haven't heard in years. Why bring her up now?" Kendra decided to speak up. "Because it might be connected to my past, to who I really am." Sam's smile didn't falter, but his eyes darkened. "Well, isn't that fascinating? Charles, you always had a knack for finding interesting people." Charles ignored the jab and stepped closer to his brother. "I didn't bring her here for your approval, Sam. I brought her here because I need answers, and you might be able to help." Sam's laughter echoed through the grand hall. "Me help, Charles? You've always been the sentimental one, chasing ghosts, digging up the past. It's exhausting, really." "It's not just the past," Charles said, his voice firm. "This is real. She's wearing the pendant I gave Sandra, the one-of-a-kind piece I had made." Sam's gaze snapped back to Kendra, his interest visibly piqued. He stepped closer, his movements deliberate and measured. "May I see it?" Kendra hesitated, but finally held up the pendant. Sam examined it carefully, his fingers brushing the engraved surface. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "It really does look like Sandra's." He let the pendant fall back against Kendra's chest and stepped away, his expression unreadable. "But that doesn't mean anything. People lose things all the time. Maybe someone found it and passed it along. You're jumping to conclusions." "I don't think so," Charles said, his tone icy. "And neither does Kendra." Sam's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I see. So you're determined to chase this fantasy no matter where it leads. Fine, but don't expect me to indulge it." Kendra felt the tension in the room rise as the two brothers stared each other down. She had no idea what kind of history they shared, but it was clear there was no love lost between them. "Well," Sam said finally, breaking the silence, "if you insist on dredging up ancient history, I suppose I can't stop you. But don't say I didn't warn you." "Warn me about what?" Charles asked sharply. Sam smirked, a hint of malice in his eyes. "That the truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it destroys you." With that, he turned and strode out of the room, leaving Kendra and Charles alone in the echoing silence of the grand hall. Kendra exhaled shakily, her nerves frayed. "What was that about?" Charles shook his head. "Sam has always had a way of twisting things. Don't let him get to you." "Do you think he knows something?" Kendra asked. "I don't just think so," Charles said, his voice steely. "I know he does." Kendra glanced toward the doorway, where Sam had disappeared. There was something about him that unnerved her, an undercurrent of menace beneath his polished exterior. As they left the Mecker estate, Kendra couldn't shake the feeling that Sam's warning was more than just empty words. Something told her that digging into the past would come with a price, and Sam might be more involved in that past than either of them realized. For now, though, she pushed those thoughts aside. There were more pressing questions to answer, and she wasn't about to back down. The following morning, Kendra sat at her kitchen table, staring at the pendant resting in her hand. The encounter with Sam had left her feeling unsettled. His words, the way he had dismissed the significance of the pendant, and the tension between him and Charles, all of it fell off. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She opened it to find Charles standing there, holding a small, weathered box. "Good morning," he said, offering a small smile. "I thought we could start piecing this together." Kendra stepped aside to let him in. "What's in the box?" Charles placed it on the table and opened it carefully. Inside were old photographs, letters, and a few keepsakes, including another pendant, a perfect match to Kendra's. "This was Sandra's," Charles said softly, picking up the pendant and holding it up to the light. "It's the only other one like yours. I had them made as she always wore hers, and I assumed this one was lost with her." Kendra stared at the matching pendants, her heart pounding. "It's identical," she whispered. Charles nodded, his gaze distant. "I kept it after the accident. I thought it would be my only connection to her." He trailed off, his voice thick with emotion. Kendra's eyes drifted to the photographs in the box. She picked one up, a picture of Sandra standing in a sunny garden, her smile radiant. Around her neck was the pendant. "She looks so happy," Kendra said, her voice barely audible. "She was," Charles replied, sitting down across from her. Sandra had this way of lighting up a room. Everyone loved her, but she never let it go to her head. "She was everything to me." Kendra placed the photo back in the box, her fingers brushing against a folded piece of paper. She pulled it out and opened it carefully. It was a letter, written in neat, flowing script. "My dearest Charles, I can't wait for the day when we finally meet our little one. You've been my rock through everything, and I know you'll be an incredible father. This child is our miracle, and I promise to cherish every moment we have as a family. Forever yours, Sandra." Kendra's throat tightened as she read the words. "She wrote this to you?" Charles nodded, his eyes glistening. "She left it for me the morning of the accident. I never imagined it would be one of the last things I'd have of her." Kendra folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. "What else do you have? Anything that could tell us more?" Charles hesitated before pulling out another photograph. This one was different. It showed Sandra standing beside Sam, who wore a smug expression. "Why is Sam in this picture?" Kendra asked, frowning. Sam and Sandra had a complicated relationship, Charles admitted. "He was my older brother and I always looked up to him, but when Sandra and I got together, things changed. So, he wanted her, but she never felt the same way. He resented me for it." Kendra's stomach twisted. Do you think he had something to do with her disappearance?" Charles's expression darkened. "I don't know, but he's hiding something, that much I'm sure of." Kendra considered his words carefully. "If Sam knows something, how do we get him to talk?" Charles exhaled sharply. "That's the challenge. Sam won't give up anything willingly. He's too calculated for that." A sudden thought struck Kendra. "What about the investigator you mentioned before? Could they dig up something on Sam?" Charles's eyes lit up with determination. "That's a good idea. I'll call him today." They spent the rest of the morning going through the contents of the box, piecing together fragments of Sandra's life. Each photograph, each letter felt like a breadcrumb leading them closer to the truth. By the afternoon, Charles's investigator had agreed to take on the case. Kendra watched as Charles relayed everything they knew so far, his voice steady and resolute. After the call, Charles turned to her. "This is a step forward. If Sam's involved, the investigator will find out." Kendra nodded, though unease still gnawed at her. "What if we don't like what we find?" Charles's gaze softened. "Then we deal with it together." That evening, Kendra sat alone in her apartment, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of uncovering something huge, something that could change everything. As she stared at the pendant, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Charles. "Stay strong, Kendra. We'll get to the bottom of this, I promise." She smiled faintly, typing back a simple reply. "I hope so." Little did she know, the answers they sought were closer than either of them realized, and the secrets they were about to uncover would be far darker than they imagined. Kendra sat quietly in Charles's car as they drove toward the site of Sandra's accident. The city streets gradually gave way to winding country roads, their surroundings turning from urban gray to lush greens and browns. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, adding an air of solemnity to the journey. "Are you sure about this?" Kendra asked, her voice breaking the silence. Charles glanced at her briefly, before returning his eyes to the road. "I need to see it again. Maybe we missed something all those years ago. Maybe there's something there that will make sense now." Kendra nodded, though a knot of unease had settled in her stomach. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to stir up something far bigger than either of them anticipated. The crash site was on a secluded stretch of road bordered by dense woods. Charles pulled the car to the shoulder and killed the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. "This is it," Charles said finally, his voice tight. This is where they found her car. Kendra stepped out of the car, the cool breeze ruffling her hair. The area was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. She followed Charles to a spot where the trees parted slightly, revealing a steep embankment. She went off the road here, Charles explained, pointing to the edge of the embankment. The car was found down there, crushed against those rocks. Kendra peered down, her heart sinking at the sight of the jagged terrain below. How did they know it was an accident? They didn't, Charles admitted. Not entirely. There were skid marks on the road but no sign of another vehicle. The police concluded she lost control. But you never believed it, Kendra finished for him. Charles nodded. Sandra was a careful driver. She wouldn't have been speeding here, especially not while pregnant. And there were other things that didn't add up. Like what? Kendra asked, frowning. Charles hesitated, his jaw tightening. The doors were locked from the outside when they found the car. That wasn't public knowledge, but the investigator told me it didn't make sense. If it was an accident, how could the doors lock like that? Kendra frowned, her unease growing. Did they find anything else? Anything in the car? Nothing unusual, Charles said. Just her purse, some baby items she'd bought that day, and the blanket, the one you were wrapped in when they found you. Kendra's breath hitched. The thought of being there, so close to tragedy yet somehow surviving, sent a shiver down her spine. As they stood there, lost in thought, the sound of a snapping branch startled them. Kendra spun around, her heart racing, but there was no one in sight. Probably just an animal, Charles said, though his tone was cautious. Kendra didn't feel reassured. Let's keep moving. They spent the next hour combing the area, looking for anything that might provide a clue. Kendra found herself drawn to a patch of ground near the embankment where the soil seemed unnaturally disturbed. Charles, over here, she called. He joined her, his brow furrowing as he examined the spot. What is it? I'm not sure, Kendra admitted, but it looks like someone dug here recently. Charles crouched down, brushing away some of the loose dirt. Why would someone dig here after all these years? Before Kendra could respond, the sound of tires crunching on gravel made them both freeze. They turned to see a black SUV pulling up behind Charles's car. A man in a suit stepped out, his expression calm but his posture rigid. Mr. Mecker, the man said, addressing Charles. You shouldn't be here. Who are you? Charles demanded, stepping protectively in front of Kendra. The man didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a badge. Private security. I work for Sam Mecker. Kendra's stomach sank. Sam sent you. The man's gaze flicked to her briefly, before returning to Charles. Mr. Mecker requested that this area remain undisturbed. He'd prefer you respect his wishes. Charles's jaw clenched. Sam has no authority here. This is about Sandra. About what happened to her. Be that as it may, the man said, his tone even. I'm here to ensure that no further disruptions occur. Kendra felt a surge of anger. Disruptions? We're trying to find the truth. What is Sam so afraid of us discovering? The man didn't respond. His silence spoke volumes. Tell Sam, Charles said coldly, that I won't stop. If he has something to hide, I'll find it. The man's expression remained impassive. I'll relay the message. With that, he climbed back into the SUV and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Kendra turned to Charles, her hands trembling. What does Sam have to do with this? Why would he send someone to stop us? Charles's expression darkened. Because he knows we're getting close, and he's scared. Kendra's gaze drifted back to the disturbed patch of soil. Do you think he's hiding something here? I wouldn't put it past him, Charles said, but we'll need more than a hunch to prove it. As they made their way back to the car, Kendra couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. The weight of the secrets they were unearthing pressed heavily on her, and she knew this was only the beginning. Charles paced his spacious office, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. Kendra sat on the edge of the couch, her pendant clutched in her hand, watching him with growing unease. The encounter with Sam's security had left both of them rattled, and the questions swirling in her mind seemed endless. "Yes, I need those reports immediately," Charles barked into the phone. "And dig into Sam's financials." He ended the call abruptly and turned to Kendra, running a hand through his hair. "My investigator is looking into Sam. If he's hiding something, we'll find it." Kendra nodded, though a part of her wasn't convinced it would be that simple. Why would Sam send someone to stop us if he's innocent? Why does he care what we find? Charles sighed heavily, leaning against his desk. "Because he's not innocent, Kendra. I've known Sam my whole life, and he's always been manipulative. He thrives on control, and he hates losing it." "What happened between you two?" Kendra asked cautiously. "I mean, before all of this." Charles hesitated, his gaze distant. "We were close once. Growing up, Sam was the golden child. Our parents adored him. He could do no wrong. But when I met Sandra," his voice trailed off, and his expression hardened. "He changed. He wanted her, but she never saw him that way. And when we got married, it only made things worse." Kendra frowned. "You think he resented you for it?" Charles let out a bitter laugh. "Resented me? He hated me for it. And when Sandra told me she was pregnant, well, that was the final straw. Sam started distancing himself from us. He claimed he was busy with work, but I knew better. He couldn't stand to see us happy." Kendra's stomach churned. "Do you think he had something to do with the accident?" Charles's jaw tightened. "I don't want to believe that, but the more I think about it, the more it adds up. Sam was in the area that day. He admitted as much when the police questioned him. And now with everything he's doing to stop us." Kendra felt the chill run down her spine. If he's capable of something like that, what else is he hiding? Before Charles could respond, his office door swung open, and Sam strode in, his presence filling the room like a thunderstorm. "Charles," Sam said, his voice cool and calculated. "I heard you've been poking around places you shouldn't." Charles's eyes narrowed. "And I heard you sent someone to keep us away. Care to explain?" Sam smirked, his gaze shifting to Kendra. "You've been keeping busy, haven't you? Stirring up the past, dragging people into your little crusade." "This isn't about me," Charles shot back. "It's about Sandra. About what happened to her. And if you have nothing to hide, why are you trying so hard to stop us?" Sam's expression darkened. "I'm trying to protect this family. Something you clearly don't care about." "Protect it from what?" Kendra interjected, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "From the truth," Sam snapped. His gaze locked with hers, and for a moment, Kendra thought she saw a flicker of fear perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by his usual composure. "You don't know what you're talking about," Sam said dismissively. "Then enlighten me," Kendra challenged. "What are you so afraid of us finding?" Sam's lips curled into a cold smile. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? Let me give you a piece of advice. Sometimes it's better to leave the past buried." Charles stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. "Not this time. We're going to find out the truth, Sam, whether you like it or not." Sam held his brother's gaze for a long moment before letting out a soft chuckle. "Fine. Dig all you want, but don't come crying to me when you don't like what you find." With that, he turned on his heel and left, the door slamming shut behind him. Kendra exhaled shakily. "He's hiding something. I'm sure of it." Charles nodded, his jaw set. "And we're going to find out what it is." That evening, Kendra sat in her apartment, sifting through the photos and letters Charles had given her. Each piece felt like a puzzle, a fragment of a life she couldn't remember but was desperate to understand. One photo caught her attention. Sandra standing in front of a small lake, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. In the background, a shadowy figure stood near the water's edge. Kendra squinted, trying to make out the figure's face, but the image was too blurry. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. It was Charles. "I found something," he said without preamble. "You need to see this." What is it? Kendra asked, her heart racing. Records. Financial records. Sam made a large payment to a private investigator the week after Sandra's accident. Kendra's blood ran cold. Why would he do that? I don't know, Charles admitted. But it's suspicious, to say the least. And there's more. The investigator he hired specializes in making things disappear. Kendra's hand tightened around the phone. You think Sam paid him to cover something up? It's possible, Charles said grimly. But if we're going to prove it, we need more than speculation. We need evidence. Kendra stared at the photo in her lap, her mind racing. Then let's find it. As she hung up, a sense of determination washed over her. Sam might have spent years burying the truth, but Kendra was done running from her past. It was time to confront it head-on. The tension was palpable as Kendra walked briskly down the hallway of her apartment building. The events of the past few days replayed in her mind, each revelation tightening the knot in her stomach. Charles's discovery about Sam's financial dealings with a private investigator had shaken her, but it had also strengthened her resolve. As she reached her door, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Charles again. Kendra, he said without preamble. I've been digging further into Sam's records. There's something you need to know. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, setting her bag on the counter. What is it? Sam didn't just hire a private investigator, Charles said. He made another payment, a much larger one, to someone tied to questionable activities. It's starting to look like he didn't just cover up Sandra's disappearance. He might have orchestrated it. Kendra froze, her hand gripping the phone tightly. You're saying Sam might have? A loud crash interrupted her, shattering the stillness of her apartment. She spun around, her heart racing, and saw the front door splintering inward as a man forced his way through. Kendra's eyes widened as she heard Charles's voice shout through the phone, but she barely registered it. The intruder was tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by a hood. Without thinking, Kendra grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and hurled it at him. It shattered against his arm, making him stumble but not stop. She ran toward the kitchen, her pulse thundering in her ears. She grabbed a knife from the counter, holding it out in front of her as the man advanced. Who are you? She demanded, her voice trembling but firm. What do you want? The man didn't answer. Instead, he lunged, grabbing for her arm. Kendra reacted instinctively, slashing the knife toward him. He recoiled with a grunt, a dark stain spreading on his sleeve. The distraction gave her just enough time to dart around him and head for the door. She sprinted down the hallway, her bare feet pounding against the floor, and burst into the stairwell. Her phone was still clutched in her hand, and Charles's voice was faint but frantic. Kendra, are you okay? What's happening? Someone's here, she gasped, descending the stairs as fast as she could. I think Sam sent him. Where are you? Charles demanded. My apartment. I'm running. Her words were cut off as she tripped on the last step, falling hard onto the landing. Pain shot through her ankle, but she scrambled to her feet, forcing herself to keep moving. Bursting through the stairwell door, Kendra found herself in the dimly lit parking garage. She ducked behind a row of cars, trying to catch her breath. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the garage, and her heart sank. He was still following her. Kendra's eyes darted around, searching for an escape route. Her gaze landed on a nearby maintenance door, slightly ajar. She limped toward it as quietly as possible, slipping inside and closing it behind her. The room was small and cluttered, filled with cleaning supplies and old equipment. She crouched behind a stack of boxes, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Kendra, listen to me, Charles said, his voice steady despite the panic in his tone. Stay hidden. I'm calling the police. Just hold on. Tears stung her eyes, but she nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Okay, she whispered. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped just outside the door. Kendra held her breath, her entire body trembling, as the handle turned slowly. The door creaked open, and the man stepped inside. He scanned the room, his movements deliberate and predatory. Kendra's grip on the knife tightened, her knuckles white. He moved closer, his boots scraping against the concrete floor. Kendra's mind raced, weighing her options. She could wait and hope he didn't find her, or she could fight. Before she could decide, the sound of sirens pierced the air. The man stiffened, glancing toward the door. Kendra saw her chance. She lunged from her hiding spot, slashing at him with the knife. He stumbled back, startled, and she bolted past him, throwing open the door and running toward the sound of the sirens in the distance. Red and blue lights flashed, and uniformed officers poured into the garage. Kendra ran to them, collapsing into the arms of the nearest cop. "He's in there," she cried, pointing toward the maintenance room. The officers moved quickly, their shouts echoing through the garage. Moments later, the man was dragged out in handcuffs, his hood pushed back to reveal a scarred face. Kendra watched from a safe distance, her entire body trembling. Charles arrived minutes later, his face pale with worry as he pulled her into a protective hug. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice raw. She nodded, though tears streamed down her face. "I think so." Charles's jaw tightened as he looked toward the handcuffed man. "We need to find out who sent him, and I think we both know the answer." Kendra wiped her eyes, her resolve hardening. "If Sam thinks he can scare me off, he's wrong. I'm not stopping until we know the truth." Charles nodded, his expression grim. "Neither am I." As the police escorted the intruder away, Kendra couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Sam's actions had escalated, and the stakes had never been higher. But Kendra wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready to fight back. Kendra sat at Charles's kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. The events of the previous night played over and over in her mind. The man who had broken into her apartment, the knife in her hand, the sound of sirens. Every detail felt sharp and vivid. Charles paced the room, his phone pressed to his ear. He had been making calls since early morning, determined to uncover who had sent the intruder. "Let me know the moment you have anything concrete," he said sharply before hanging up. Turning to Kendra, he softened his tone. "Are you sure you're okay?" Kendra nodded, though she felt anything but okay. "I'm just shaken, but I'm not backing down." Charles gave her a reassuring nod. "Good, because we might have a lead." He sat across from her, sliding a folder onto the table. Inside were documents and photos, police reports, witness statements, and a single name circled in red. Mark Sign. "Who's Mark Sign?" Kendra asked, picking up the folder. "A retired detective," Charles explained. "He was one of the first responders at the scene of Sandra's accident. I tracked him down, and he agreed to talk to us." Kendra's heart raced. "Do you think he knows something?" "I think he saw things that didn't make it into the official report," Charles said. "If Sam's involved, Mark might have answers." They arrived at Mark Sign's modest home later that afternoon. The house was small but well-kept, with a neatly trimmed lawn and a porch swing that creaked softly in the breeze. Mark greeted them at the door, his gray hair and weathered face reflecting a life spent in service. His eyes were sharp, however, and he studied Kendra with quiet curiosity. "You must be Kendra," he said, extending a hand. "You look like her, you know." "Sandra." Kendra froze. The weight of his words sank in. "You knew her?" "Not well," Mark said, gesturing for them to come inside. "But I remember her. I remember the day we got the call about her car." They followed him into the living room, where he motioned for them to sit. Mark settled into an armchair, his expression turning somber. "That accident never sat right with me," he began. "There were too many things that didn't add up. The locked doors, the missing body. But there was something else, something I didn't include in my report." "What was it?" Charles asked, leaning forward. Mark hesitated, his fingers tapping against the armrest. "There were tire tracks near the embankment. Fresh tracks from another car. I pointed it out to my superior, but he told me to leave it out of the report. Said it wasn't relevant." Kendra's stomach twisted. Why would they tell you to leave it out? I didn't question it at the time, Mark admitted. But now I think someone wanted it buried. Charles's expression darkened. Did Sam Mecker have anything to do with it? Mark met his gaze, his voice steady. Sam was there that day. He showed up while we were processing the scene, claimed he wanted to help, but he seemed more interested in what we'd found, or what we hadn't. Kendra's breath caught. And you think he had something to do with Sandra's disappearance? Mark's gaze softened as he looked at her. I can't say for sure, but Sam Mecker was always a man with connections. If he wanted something covered up, he had the means to make it happen. Charles sat back, his jaw clenched. Why didn't you come forward with this before? Mark let out a heavy sigh. Because I didn't have proof. Going after someone like Sam Mecker, without it, that's a battle you don't win. Kendra's voice was quiet but firm. What about now? Would you be willing to help us? Mark studied her for a long moment before nodding. I'll do what I can. But if you're going to take Sam down, you'll need more than my testimony. You'll need hard evidence. Charles nodded, determination flashing in his eyes. We'll find it. As they left Mark's house, Kendra felt a strange mix of hope and dread. The retired detective had confirmed their suspicions, but his warning lingered in her mind. What if we don't find the evidence we need? Kendra asked as they got into Charles's car. Charles's grip on the steering wheel tightened. We will. Sam's made mistakes, and we're going to uncover every single one of them. That evening, Kendra sat alone in her apartment, sifting through the documents Charles had given her. Mark's words echoed in her mind. You'll need hard evidence. Her gaze fell on the photo she had found earlier. Sandra by the lake. The shadowy figure in the background. Something about it nagged at her, an itch she couldn't scratch. She grabbed her phone and snapped a picture of the photo, sending it to Charles with a message. Can you have someone enhance this image? I think there's something here. Minutes later, Charles replied, On it. Stay safe. Kendra set the phone down and exhaled deeply. The walls around her seemed to close in, the weight of the past pressing heavily on her chest. But beneath the fear, a fire burned. She wasn't just searching for answers anymore. She was fighting for the truth, and she wouldn't stop until she had it. Kendra's phone buzzed early the next morning, the vibration cutting through the stillness of her apartment. She reached for it groggy, barely registering the name on the screen before answering. Kendra, it's Charles, his voice urgent. I had the photo enhanced. You need to come to my office immediately. Her heart skipped a beat. What did you find? I'll show you when you get here. Just hurry. The call ended abruptly, leaving Kendra wide awake. She dressed quickly, anxiety building in her chest as she made her way to the Mecker Global Enterprises building. When she arrived, Charles was already waiting for her in his office, a large monitor on the wall displaying the enhanced photo. Look, he said, gesturing to the screen. Kendra stepped closer, her eyes scanning the image. The shadowy figure in the background was now clear, a man standing near the lake, his face partially turned away, but unmistakable. It's Sam, she whispered, her voice shaking. Charles nodded grimly. This was taken just days before Sandra's disappearance. He told me he hadn't seen her for weeks before the accident. He lied. Kendra's mind raced. Do you think he was following her, watching her? It's possible, Charles said. But this isn't enough. We need to know why he was there and what he was doing. Before Kendra could respond, Charles's assistant knocked and entered the room, carrying a thick envelope. This just arrived for you, Mr. Mecker. Charles opened it, pulling out a set of documents and flipping through them quickly. His expression darkened as he read. What is it? Kendra asked, her stomach twisting at the sight of his clenched jaw. The room fell silent. Kendra watched as the weight of Charles's words settled over the board, their expressions shifting from disbelief to reluctant acceptance. Meanwhile, Sam paced the living room of his penthouse, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. The television in the corner played the same news segment on a loop, each word like a knife twisting in his gut. In a shocking turn of events, Sam Mecker, once a prominent figure in Mecker Global Enterprises, now faces serious allegations regarding his involvement in Sandra Mecker's disappearance. Sources suggest financial records and witness testimony have surfaced, casting a shadow over his legacy. Sam grabbed the remote and hurled it at the screen, shattering the glass in an explosion of sparks. "How dare he?" Sam muttered, his voice venomous. "How dare Charles drag me through the mud?" His assistant, a nervous man named Greg, hovered near the doorway. "Mr. Mecker, perhaps it's time to consider." "Consider what?" Sam snapped, his eyes blazing. "Admitting to something I didn't do? Letting my brother ruin me?" Greg hesitated. "If the investigation continues, they'll find more. Maybe it's better to—" "To what?" Sam interrupted, his voice dangerously low. "Run and hide? I built this family's empire just as much as Charles did. I won't let him take it from me." Greg swallowed hard, retreating a step. "Understood, sir." Sam turned away, his mind racing. He needed a plan, something to stop Charles and Kendra before they unearthed anything else. The next morning, Kendra arrived at Charles's office, greeted by a somber-looking assistant. "Mr. Mecker's waiting for you," she said, her voice hushed. Kendra stepped inside to find Charles seated at his desk, his face drawn but determined. "What's wrong?" Kendra asked, closing the door behind her. Charles gestured to his laptop. "Sam's team is fighting back. They've issued a statement denying everything and accusing us of fabricating evidence." Kendra's stomach sank. "Can they do that?" "They can try," Charles said, "but we have enough to counter it. The problem is, Sam isn't just playing defense, he's going on the offensive." "What do you mean?" Charles leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "He's filed a lawsuit against me for defamation. He's claiming I'm using this investigation to destroy him and take full control of the company." Kendra's eyes widened. "That's absurd." "It's a distraction tactic," Charles said. "If he can tie us up in court, it slows everything down. He's buying time." Kendra clenched her fists. "What do we do?" "We keep pushing," Charles said firmly. "The evidence is solid, and Mark Sine is prepared to testify. Sam can deny it all he wants, but the truth will come out." Kendra nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then let's not give him a chance to regroup." That evening, Kendra returned to her apartment to find a letter slipped under her door. Her heart raced as she picked it up, the envelope heavy in her hands. Inside was a single piece of paper, typed in bold black letters. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Stop now, or you'll regret it." Her breath caught. She glanced around the hallway, her pulse pounding. No one was in sight, but the sense of being watched lingered. She immediately called Charles, her voice trembling as she relayed what had happened. "Stay there," Charles said, his tone protective. "I'm coming over." Within minutes, Charles arrived with 2 security guards in tow. He examined the note, his expression dark. "This is Sam," he said. "It has to be." Kendra shook her head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why can't he just admit what he did? Why is he still trying to scare us?" "Because he's desperate," Charles said. "And desperate people make mistakes." He turned to the guards. "From now on, I want someone stationed here 24/7. Kendra isn't going anywhere alone." "I can take care of myself, Charles," Kendra protested. "I know you can," he said gently. "But I'm not taking any chances." As the guards set up their post outside her apartment, Kendra sat on the couch, her pendant warm against her skin. She felt the weight of it, not just physically, but emotionally. "We're close," Charles said, sitting beside her. "Sam knows it. That's why he's lashing out. We just need to hold on a little longer." Kendra nodded, determination burning in her chest. Sam's desperation only fueled her resolve. No matter what he tried, she wouldn't back down, not now, not ever. The tension in the Mecker family saga reached a fever pitch. Kendra sat in Charles's office, staring at the stack of documents spread across the table. The note left at her apartment had rattled her, but it also steeled her determination. Sam was unraveling, and she was more certain than ever that the truth was within reach. "Mark's ready to testify," Charles said, breaking the silence. "He's going to meet us at the courthouse tomorrow. Sam won't be able to deny anything once Mark corroborates the evidence." Kendra nodded, though a lingering unease tugged at her. "Do you think Sam will show up, or will he try to run?" Charles's jaw tightened. "If I know my brother, he'll try to save himself any way he can. But he won't get far." That evening, Sam sat alone in his penthouse, the weight of the past few days bearing down on him like a storm cloud. His usual confidence had been replaced by simmering panic. The walls were closing in, and the cracks in his carefully constructed facade were growing wider. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Greg, his ever-nervous assistant, entered cautiously. "Mr. Mecker," Greg began, his voice hesitant. "We need to discuss options." Sam shot him a venomous glare. "Options? The only option is to stop them." "With respect, sir," Greg said, his hands fidgeting, "that's no longer viable. The evidence they have, it's damning. If this goes to court, you'll lose everything." Sam stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Then it doesn't go to court. We end it before it gets that far." Greg paled. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Sam said, his voice cold and measured, "we eliminate the problem." Greg took a cautious step back. "Sir, that's illegal." Sam finished for him, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. "Spare me the morality lecture, Greg. Just make the arrangements." Greg hesitated, his face pale and drawn, but he nodded and left the room, leaving Sam to his scheming. The next morning, Kendra and Charles arrived at the courthouse early. Mark was already there, sitting quietly in a corner of the waiting area. He looked up as they approached, his face lined with a mixture of resolve and apprehension. "Are you ready?" Charles asked, his voice steady. Mark nodded. "I've carried this for 25 years. It's time to let it go." As the three of them prepared for the hearing, Charles's phone buzzed. He frowned at the screen. "What is it?" Kendra asked, noticing the concern on his face. "It's the investigator," Charles said, stepping aside to take the call. Kendra and Mark exchanged a glance, the tension thick in the air. Moments later, Charles returned, his expression grim. "Sam's trying to flee," he said. "He booked a private flight out of JFK for tonight." Kendra's heart sank. "What do we do?" Charles's eyes burned with determination. "We stop him." That evening, the atmosphere at JFK was charged with anticipation. Charles had alerted the authorities, who were waiting discreetly near the private terminal. Kendra stayed close to him, her heart pounding as they watched for any sign of Sam. It wasn't long before a sleek black car pulled up to the terminal. Sam stepped out, his expression calm, but his movements hurried. "There he is," Charles said, his voice low. The authorities moved swiftly, intercepting Sam before he could board the jet waiting on the tarmac. For a moment, Sam looked stunned, but he quickly composed himself, his mask of confidence slipping back into place. "Charles," Sam said smoothly as the officers cuffed his wrists, "this is dramatic even for you." "You brought this on yourself," Charles replied, his tone cold. Sam's eyes flicked to Kendra, his smile tightening. "And I suppose this is all because of her? You really let a nobody ruin our family." Kendra stepped forward, her voice firm. "The only person who ruined this family is you, Sam. You lied, you betrayed, and you hurt the people who trusted you." Sam's smile faltered, his facade cracking for the first time. "You don't know anything about what really happened." "Then tell us," Charles said, his voice sharp. "Tell us what happened to Sandra." Sam's gaze shifted between them, and for a moment he seemed to consider it. But then he laughed bitterly. "You think you've won," he said, "but you have no idea what you're digging into." As the officers led Sam away, Kendra felt a mix of relief and frustration. They had stopped him from fleeing, but the truth still felt just out of reach. Hours later, Back at Charles's office, they received a call from the police. Sam had confessed during interrogation. "I wanted her gone," Sam had admitted, his voice cold and detached. "She was always in the way, always the reason Charles had everything I didn't. But I didn't plan for her to survive. That wasn't supposed to happen." Kendra's blood ran cold as she listened to the recording. Sam's words confirmed everything they had feared and more. "He planned it," Charles said, his voice hollow. "He tried to kill her." Kendra's hand went to her pendant, her fingers trembling as she clutched it tightly. "But why didn't she come back?" Kendra asked, her voice breaking. "If she survived, why didn't she come back to you?" Charles shook his head, his expression pained. "I don't know, but now we can find out." Kendra nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. They were closer than ever to the truth, and she wouldn't stop until they had it. The night after Sam's arrest felt heavier than any Kendra had experienced. Sitting in Charles's office once again, she stared at the recording of Sam's confession playing on repeat. His cold words echoed in her mind, chilling her to the core. "I wanted her gone, but I didn't plan for her to survive." If Sandra had survived, why had she stayed hidden? What had kept her away from the life she had built with Charles? "We need to find her," Kendra said firmly, breaking the silence. Charles, seated across from her, looked up with tired but determined eyes. "I've already reached out to the investigator. If Sam's words are true, someone helped Sandra after the accident. That's where we start." By the following afternoon, Charles's investigator, James, arrived with new leads. Kendra and Charles sat anxiously as James spread out a series of documents and photographs across the desk. "The confession was key," James began. "Sam admitted to orchestrating the accident, but he wasn't there to ensure the job was finished. That's why Sandra survived." Kendra leaned forward. "Who helped her?" James pointed to a report. "A passing hiker found her that night. She was unconscious, but alive. He carried her to a remote cabin mile from the crash site. From there, she was treated by a local doctor who kept no official records, probably because he was wary of Sam's influence. Sandra regained consciousness after several days, but—" "What?" Charles pressed, his voice edged with desperation. James hesitated. "She had no memory of who she was. The trauma from the accident and Sam's attempt to silence her left her with severe amnesia. She couldn't remember her name, her past, or her pregnancy." Kendra's heart sank. "So, she didn't know she had a family waiting for her?" James nodded. "That's correct. The doctor gave her a false identity to protect her, not knowing who might come looking for her. She was relocated to a small town upstate, where she's been living ever since." Charles gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. "Do you know where she is now?" James handed him a photograph. It showed a woman with dark hair streaked with gray, her face weathered but undeniably familiar. She was standing in front of a small bookstore, a gentle smile on her lips. "This was taken last week," James said. "Her name is Claire Dawson now. She owns the bookstore and lives a quiet life in a town called Willow Creek." Kendra stared at the photo, her breath catching. Despite the years that had passed, she recognized the woman immediately. It was Sandra. Charles's voice broke the silence. "We're going to see her now." The drive to Willow Creek was a blur of emotions: anticipation, fear, hope. Kendra sat silently in the passenger seat, clutching the photograph tightly. Charles's hands gripped the steering wheel, his jaw set as he navigated the winding roads. When they arrived, the small town was bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon sunlight. Willow Creek was picturesque, with quaint shops lining the streets and friendly faces passing by. The bookstore stood at the end of the main road, its windows decorated with handwritten signs advertising the latest arrivals. Kendra's heart raced as she followed Charles inside. The soft chime of a bell announced their arrival. Behind the counter, a woman looked up from her book. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm and polite. Charles stepped forward, his voice trembling. Sandra. The woman blinked, confusion clouding her features. I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong person. My name is Claire. It's you, Charles said, his voice breaking. It's really you? Kendra stepped closer, holding out the photograph. Please look at this. You've been living as Claire, but your real name is Sandra Mecker. You survived an accident 25 years ago. Sandra, Claire, stared at the photograph, her hands trembling as she took it. Her expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing her face before she shook her head. I don't understand, she whispered. I don't know who you are. Charles's voice was thick with emotion. I'm your husband. This is Kendra. She's our daughter. Sandra's eyes widened, her breathing shallow. No, that can't be. I don't have a family. I've been alone my whole life. Tears welled in Kendra's eyes. You did have a family and we've been looking for you all this time? Sandra took a step back, her hand pressed to her chest. This doesn't make sense. How can this be true? Charles reached for her hand, his touch gentle. It's true, Sandra. Sam tried to take you away from us, but you survived. You've been missing for 25 years, but we finally found you. For a long moment, Sandra said nothing, her gaze flicking between Charles and Kendra. Then, her knees buckled, and Charles caught her before she fell. Are you okay? He asked, his voice full of concern. I need a moment, Sandra murmured, her voice shaky. Charles and Kendra helped her to a chair. She sat there silently, clutching the photograph as tears streamed down her face. I don't remember any of it, she said finally, her voice barely audible. I don't remember you. I don't remember anything. Kendra knelt beside her, her voice soft but firm. It's okay. You don't have to remember everything right now. We're here to help you. You're not alone anymore. Sandra looked at her, her expression a mixture of confusion and longing. You really think I'm your mother? I don't think, Kendra said, her voice breaking. I know. Sandra's hand reached for Kendra's pendant, her fingers brushing against the familiar engraving. A single tear slid down her cheek as she whispered, forever marked. Charles's voice was full of emotion. Welcome home, Sandra. The drive back to New York City was filled with a fragile silence. Kendra sat beside Sandra in the back seat, glancing at her every so often, unsure of what to say. Charles drove carefully, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. Sandra clutched the photograph Kendra had given her, staring at it as though trying to unlock a part of her mind that had been sealed shut for decades. I don't know how to feel about all this, Sandra said softly, breaking the silence. Her voice trembled, a mix of confusion and sadness. It's like I've been living someone else's life all these years. It's going to take time, Charles said gently, keeping his eyes on the road. You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just know that we're here for you. Kendra reached over and touched Sandra's hand lightly. We'll help you, Mom. The word felt foreign on her tongue, but it came naturally, as though it had been waiting all her life to be spoken. Sandra blinked, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to respond, but said nothing. Instead, she squeezed Kendra's hand, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they were beginning to rebuild. When they arrived at Charles's estate, Sandra hesitated on the doorstep. This feels so familiar, she murmured, her eyes scanning the grand facade. But it's like looking at a dream I can't quite remember. Charles opened the door and guided her inside. Take your time. There's no rush. As they walked through the house, Sandra's gaze lingered on the family photos lining the walls. She paused in front of one in particular, a picture of her and Charles on their wedding day. Her fingers brushed the edge of the frame. I look so happy, she said quietly. Charles's voice thickened with emotion. He said you were? Kendra watched the exchange, her heart aching for the years they had lost. She wanted to say something comforting, but the weight of the moment held her back. Later that evening, they sat together in the living room, the soft glow of the fireplace casting warm light across the room. Sandra sat on the couch, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Kendra and Charles sat nearby, their attention focused entirely on her. I keep thinking about everything I've missed, Sandra said, her voice breaking slightly. Kendra, I didn't even know you existed. And now here you are, all grown up. Kendra smiled faintly. I've been waiting for this moment my whole life. To know where I came from, to know who you are. It means everything to me. Sandra reached for Kendra's hand, her grip firm despite the tremor in her fingers. I wish I could remember. I wish I could tell you all the things a mother is supposed to say. You don't have to remember, Kendra said, her voice steady. You're here now. That's all that matters. Charles cleared his throat, his voice tinged with emotion. We can start fresh, build something new together. The past doesn't have to define us. Sandra nodded, though tears glistened in her eyes. I want that more than anything. The next few days were a blur of cautious steps toward healing. Sandra explored the estate, reacquainting herself with the life she had left behind. She spent hours in the study, flipping through photo albums, each image a piece of the puzzle she was trying to reassemble. Kendra stayed close, answering Sandra's questions and sharing stories of her own life. They laughed together over Kendra's childhood misadventures, and for the first time, Sandra's laughter felt genuine, a glimpse of the woman she once was. Charles, too, found solace in the reunion. He watched Sandra and Kendra bond, his heart swelling with a sense of completeness he hadn't felt in decades. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Sandra spoke hesitantly. I've been thinking about Sam. The air in the room grew heavy. Charles set down his glass, his expression darkening. What about him? Sandra looked at Kendra, then back at Charles. I want to confront him. Charles's jaw tightened. Sandra, after everything he's done. I know what he did, Sandra interrupted, her voice steady. But I need to face him. I need to understand why. Kendra placed a hand on her mother's arm. Are you sure? He's dangerous, even now. Sandra nodded. I'm sure. I've spent too long running from my past. It's time to face it. Charles sighed, his protective instincts warring with his respect for Sandra's decision. If that's what you want, we'll make it happen. But I'll be there with you. You're not doing this alone. Sandra smiled faintly, gratitude shining in her eyes. Thank you. As the night wore on, Kendra found herself sitting alone with Sandra in the living room. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence between them. Do you really believe we can be a family again? Sandra asked, her voice tentative. Kendra looked at her, her gaze unwavering. I do. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But we have a chance now. That's all I've ever wanted. Sandra reached out and tucked a strand of Kendra's hair behind her ear. You're strong, stronger than I could have ever imagined. I'm so proud of you. Tears welled in Kendra's eyes, but she smiled, her heart swelling with hope. I'm proud of you too, Mom. For the first time in years, Sandra felt a glimmer of peace. The road ahead was uncertain, but she knew she wasn't walking it alone anymore. The sterile atmosphere of the correctional facility felt suffocating. Kendra sat beside Charles in the visitor's room, her heart pounding in her chest. Across the table, Sandra sat silently, her face pale but resolute. She was about to confront the man who had tried to destroy her life, a confrontation decades in the making. When the heavy door creaked open, Sam was led into the room, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked disheveled, his once pristine appearance replaced by a gaunt face and weary eyes. But as he spotted Sandra, his lips curled into a faint mocking smile. Well, Sam drawled, his voice dripping with disdain, look who decided to come back from the dead. Sandra didn't flinch. She met his gaze steadily, her voice firm. I came for answers, Jared. Sam chuckled, the sound bitter. Answers? What makes you think you deserve them? I deserve the truth, Sandra said, her tone unwavering. And so do Charles and Kendra. Why did you do it? Why did you try to kill me? Sam leaned back in his chair, his eyes flicking to Charles. "Oh, you really think this is about you, don't you? Poor perfect Sandra, the golden girl who could do no wrong." "This isn't about me," Sandra snapped, her voice rising. "This is about your jealousy, your hatred. You couldn't stand that Charles and I were happy, so you tried to destroy us. But why? What did we ever do to you?" Sam's facade cracked, his expression twisting with anger. "You took everything from me," he spat. "You and Charles. All my life I was second best. Second to him, second to you. I was never enough, not for our parents, not for the company, and certainly not for you." Sandra stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. "You hated me that much?" "I didn't hate you," Sam said, his voice softening briefly before hardening again. "I hated what you represented. You were his, and I wanted you to be mine." The room fell silent, Sam's confession hanging heavy in the air. Charles, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward, his voice cold. "You destroyed this family because you couldn't handle your own failures. You're pathetic, Sam." Sam's eyes flashed with fury, but he said nothing. Sandra took a deep breath, her voice calm but resolute. "I pity you, Sam. You could have had a family. You could have been part of something bigger than yourself, but instead you chose bitterness and destruction. And look where it got you." Sam's lips tightened, but he didn't respond. Kendra finally spoke, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You didn't just hurt them, you hurt me too. You stole my chance to know my mother, my family. But I'm not going to let your actions define my life." For a moment, Sam's gaze softened as he looked at Kendra. "You have no idea what it's like to live in someone else's shadow," he muttered. "You're right," Kendra said, her voice sharp. "I don't, but I do know what it's like to fight for the people I love. And that's something you'll never understand." Sam's shoulders slumped, his energy draining, as if the weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. He looked at Sandra one last time, but there was no triumph in his eyes, only defeat. "I did love you," he said quietly, "in my own way." Sandra shook her head, her expression unreadable. Whatever that was, it wasn't love. The guard stepped forward, signaling that the visit was over. Sam stood, his movements slow and reluctant as he was led away. Sandra exhaled deeply, her body trembling slightly. Charles reached over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's over now," he said softly. Sandra nodded, though her gaze lingered on the door Sam had disappeared through. "No, Charles. It's just beginning." The days that followed were a mix of relief and adjustment. With Sam's confession and testimony, the case was closed, and the truth finally came to light. Sandra's name was cleared, and the media frenzy surrounding the Mecker family began to fade. At the estate, life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. Sandra and Kendra spent hours together, forging a bond that had been stolen from them. They laughed, cried, and shared stories, piecing together a relationship that felt both familiar and brand new. Charles watched them with quiet contentment, his heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time, he allowed himself to hope for healing, for happiness, for the future. One evening, as the three of them sat in the garden, Kendra looked at Sandra and smiled. "I never thought I'd have this, a family." Sandra reached for her hand, her own smile soft and full of emotion. "Neither did I, but I'm so grateful we found each other." Charles raised his glass, his voice warm. "To new beginnings." Kendra and Sandra clinked their glasses with his, their laughter mingling with the gentle hum of the evening breeze. For the first time in decades, the Mecker family felt whole. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one.